So today I want to talk about one of the best ways to get college paid for you, or at least get it significantly reduced, and that's what's known as tuition reimbursement. Now, not every employer out there offers this, but I'll explain what this is. But on average, most employers offer about $5,000 per year in tuition reimbursement. So that's a significant amount of money being left on the table if it's something you don't use. Now, I don't too often see people talk about tuition reimbursement, at least explaining what it all means and some of the pros and cons dealing with tuition reimbursement through an employer. And as someone who actually used this program or a program similar to this, I thought it'd be pretty insightful to kind of share my own experience on how that all worked. And before I go too deep into it, I do want to at least explain that every employer out there is going to be different. There's going to be some employers that offer a significant amount. There's going to be some that offer very little in terms of tuition reimbursement. And there's also going to be employers that have a lot of restrictions and some that don't. So everything I'm going to say here is going to obviously be adjusted in terms of which employer you're actually working for. But in general, they pretty much all work the same. Now I'm going to explain how tuition reimbursement usually works and what it all is, especially for the people out there that may not necessarily have ever even heard about it before. But basically, it's when an employer out there decides that they're going to pay a portion of your college tuition, or sometimes it's even a training type program. So for example, if I'm going to go to get a degree in marketing and I'm working at a company that could benefit from me having a marketing degree, so it makes sense for the company to invest in me, right? They're going to pay $5,000 for me to go get a college education, or at least pay for a portion of my college education, in the hopes that they'll benefit from me getting that marketing degree. Now, I've seen it range all the way from like $1,000 to $500 to even companies that don't offer any form of tuition reimbursement. So it's definitely something to ask about. But on the opposite end, I've seen companies offer as much as $10,000 or even covering the full cost of college tuition, which, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit envious of people that work for an employer like that. Now, I thought it was at least important to point out that there is a distinction between having an employer give you a scholarship to go to college or get some kind of training versus actually having tuition reimbursement. So there's companies out there that will end up giving a scholarship for anybody that's an employee there. And sometimes a scholarship not only allows the person, the actual employee, to benefit from it, but sometimes it's something that can actually be passed on for, a grandkid or even a son or daughter may actually benefit from it. So that's kind of a way that companies like to show, company loyalty by trying to get their kids to, kind of being indoctrinated into that company. But like I said, that's significantly different than tuition reimbursement. Usually how that works is the company will agree to pay some portion, whether it be, let's just go with $5,000. And usually there's some kind of catch to it, right? So if you're an employee, you will get the $5,000 to pay for your college tuition, but you end up having to work a year after that $5,000 is paid out. Now, I've seen companies offer this all the way from 1 year all the way to 5 years. So meaning that once you get that $5,000, the very last payment that they pay out to you, you end up having to work 5 additional years after that last payment to qualify not having to owe that money back. And I'll actually talk a little bit later on how to kind of avoid that, or why I don't necessarily think that's such a big penalty. But in general, I just want to acknowledge that employers have different ranges, right? So sometimes it'll be 1 year you actually have to work there before you even qualify for the tuition reimbursement. And then once the tuition reimbursement is actually paid out, you have to work an additional year after that. Or sometimes, like I said, it's 3 or 5 years. And it's really important to understand all the nuances as far as, reading the actual policy on how the tuition reimbursement works. And sometimes there's a good chance that a lot of your coworkers may not even understand how it works, because a lot of people aren't even aware that their employer offers it. So I'll explain why it's really important to understand the details of how your employer offers your tuition reimbursement. Let's say the year is 2021, and in January, I get $1,000 from my employer, and my employer offers a cap per year of $2,000. So in January, I use the first $1,000, and it's not until December that I use the second $1,000. Some employers will begin that 1 year date not until the last payment, right? So in December of 2021, that's where my 1 year time frame starts. Some companies will basically, acknowledge the fact that they paid you $1,000 in January of 2021. So let's say you quit in February of 2022, then I won't owe the $1,000 from January because I worked there a year, but the December one I still owe. But in some companies, they actually wait till the very last payment is made, and that's when your 1 year time frame starts. And if not, then you owe the full amount. And what I would say here, it's really important to understand the details. So even kind of lay out your actual game plan or scenario to your HR person or whoever's managing the tuition reimbursement program, and basically spell out, this is how I'm going to use it. Am I understanding it correctly when I can leave, so I don't actually owe this amount back? Not that I'm necessarily planning on leaving anytime soon. I'm just wanting to make sure I understand it, and try to get that in an email or writing, so that way you have something to reference in case anything goes bad. Now, different employers handle tuition reimbursement differently. Some employers like to pay the college directly, and there's pros and cons to that, but typically an employer will usually reimburse the actual employee. So you as an individual will have to still pay your college tuition, and then later on you will submit that to your HR manager or whoever to get that reimbursement paid directly to you, or sometimes it'll just be included in a paycheck. Personally, if given the option, you'll have to weigh out the pros and cons, but typically I would favor just having the employer pay you directly, because sometimes it's just a little bit of a hassle to kind of coordinate, having your employer pay directly to the college. And a lot of HR people or a lot of different companies out there will kind of feel a little bit hesitant to do that, just because paying money to somebody that they've never seen, to a university they've never seen, just seems a little bit more complicated and a little bit more risky versus just including in your future paycheck. Now, as far as a couple of recommendations for companies to work at where the employer actually does encourage tuition reimbursement, typically a lot of grocery stores out there, that's a great place to start, especially because a lot of people have that as a high school job. So by the time you go to college, you already qualify to have that tuition reimbursement, especially if they have, you have to work there a year before you qualify for the tuition reimbursement. Usually you've already hit that amount by the time you go to college anyways. And the other reason why I kind of like grocery stores as a good option is because typically there's a lot of different branches out there. So at the off chance that you end up wanting to move, then you don't have to forego owing back that tuition reimbursement amount, right? Versus let's say it's a very specific company that's very local. If you end up moving out of state, just because you have other opportunities or you're transferring universities, then you actually will end up owing that college tuition reimbursement amount back, even though you probably would have stayed at that company, but the problem is they don't have a branch at the new university you're working at. Another great option out there too is banks. There's a lot of banks out there. It kind of works the same way, right? You have a lot of branches for, let's say, Chase or Bank of America. There's plenty of, I'm not necessarily advocating for those specific banks, but just banks in general. They have a lot of branches nationwide or even worldwide. So it's very easy to transfer. And on top of that, they usually have some kind of program too as well for like some type of mentorship or something like that. So that way, once you actually have that college degree in hand, then you also have an opportunity to kind of move up the corporate ladder. Another great option that may still exist, I'm not necessarily sure what their tuition reimbursement program still is, but when I was working at Starbucks, they had a pretty good tuition reimbursement program. But in general, what I would say here is any kind of coffee shop, chain, which pretty much leaves that at Starbucks, or any kind of like fast food chain as well. Like I believe McDonald's has a great tuition reimbursement program, or Burger King, or any kind of, big chain out there. So that way, once again, it's all about having the mobility and also that opportunity to move up the corporate ladder. There are accounting firms as well. Like if you're getting into accounting, there are accounting firms out there that offer tuition reimbursement. But the problem is if you end up wanting to kind of pivot to a different company or pivot to a different kind of career path, then you're kind of, pigeonholed yourself into that one little area. You see, like an accounting firm or a marketing firm, they would offer that tuition reimbursement. But the catch is that you have to get a marketing degree or an accounting degree, versus if you're working at Starbucks and you're getting that college tuition reimbursement, they're not necessarily caring too much what that degree may be, because they typically have so many different jobs and career paths offered for you that they're not necessarily too concerned about that. Now, as far as my general recommendation on whether or not you should use tuition reimbursement, definitely yes, try to use it, because at best case scenario, you end up getting your college paid for, at least a good portion of that college tuition paid for, which, even $5,000 per year, that ends up being $20,000 over the course of a 4-year degree. But at worst case scenario, you end up leaving that employer too soon and you end up owing that money back. But then in the end, it basically works the same way that an interest-free loan would, right? So if I'm working at an employer, they paid $10,000 for my college tuition, and then I end up leaving and owing that $10,000 back because I didn't make it to the full 3 years, but I only made it 2 years. Well, then essentially it's a 2-year interest-free $10,000 loan. So this is probably a good time to mention on how to deal with owing that tuition amount back to your employer if you don't make it to those 2 or 5 years or whatever the restriction ends up being, so that you don't owe that back. The two main tips I would have is, one, to basically negotiate that with your future employer. basically you can kind of think about it as kind of a version of a sign-on bonuses. There's companies out there that don't necessarily exclusively say that they offer sign-on bonuses, but they will. Just like there's companies out there that will offer to pay people to relocate, but they're not necessarily going to disclose that. They're not necessarily going to say right off the bat during an interview, hey, we'll pay you $5,000 to relocate, at the city that we live in. They'd rather wait and see if you negotiate that or not, but that doesn't necessarily they're not willing to pay that. Same thing is true with tuition reimbursement. You can ask for, if you owe $5,000 at your previous employer and you want to leave to this new employer, you can offer for them to pay half of that tuition and kind of explain to them that that's part of the reason why they're hiring you, right? Is that you have that college degree. And even if you're skeptical of trying that, that's okay, because you still can use that to your advantage in terms of negotiating that with your salary. So if I end up owing $10,000 to my previous employer, I can explain that to my new employer and say, just by me leaving, I'm foregoing, this $10,000 tuition reimbursement. I think blah, 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 I have all a skill set. So that's why I think it's reasonable for me to get a $3,000 pay raise, or, my salary is negotiated at that $3,000 higher rate. And that will offset the $10,000 burden, especially if you think about just working in that new company for 4 years and it's already paid for itself. Now, the second major tip as far as foregoing or having to kind of avoid that heavy burden of paying that tuition reimbursement back to the employer, especially if you don't make that 5-year time frame that they require, or 2-year time frame, is to basically accumulate a whole bunch of vacation days. So let's say I know that in 2021, I'm going to leave my current employer, and that they paid out my tuition reimbursement this December 2020, then I have to wait till the end of 2021 for them to, for me not to owe that tuition reimbursement. But if I already have in my mind that I'm probably going to leave in the middle of 2021, then what I can do is accumulate a bunch of vacation days. Let's say I accumulated 10 vacation days, and based on my hourly or salary rate, it's $100 per day. Then when I leave, they owe me $1,000 because they have to pay out that vacation time. But yet I owe them, let's say $5,000 for the tuition reimbursement. Then now it's only $4,000. So it's a little bit, it's not necessarily perfect, but it's a little bit less of a burden than having to pay the full amount. Now, obviously not every company out there actually pays out vacation time. So you really want to make sure about that, because you don't want to accumulate 10 vacation days, end up leaving thinking they're going to pay it out, but then they don't. So now you lose those 10 vacation days. And on top of that, you still owe the employer the tuition reimbursement amount that you still owe. So that's kind of worst case scenario. Make sure, like I said, you verify that they are going to pay out that vacation time. The other major tip that is kind of just an alternative consideration is there's a lot of companies out there that have some kind of restrictions as far as, how long you have to stay with the employer when it comes to college tuition reimbursement, but they don't necessarily have restrictions when it comes to paying for exams or different types of license. Let's say you're trying to, pay for the CPA exam or the bar exam. There are companies that are willing to pay for that, and there's not any, usually there's less restrictions because typically they're not that much. I mean, they're like $1,000, $2,000, but that's $2,000 you didn't have, so it's a great deal on your end. On their end, it's not necessarily so big of an amount that they're going to keep track on who's been, how many years so-and-so has been working there. So that's definitely a great alternative option if you don't want to go the college tuition reimbursement route. Now, I did want to mention as far as one other restriction that a lot of employers have as far as tuition reimbursement, and a workaround that may be the case that, is a little bit of a gray area, but bottom line is a lot of employers out there will have college tuition reimbursement only for people that have a certain grade, right? So if I end up taking a marketing class and I'm working at a marketing firm, I have to get a B or above for the employer to pay the $500, $1,000, whatever the employer is going to offer. The reality is a lot of employers don't necessarily have a detective out there that is figuring out what course load you're taking and the actual grade that you're getting. And so what you can kind of do, and this is actually a legitimate scenario, let's say you're in December and you end up, of 2020, and you end up needing the tuition reimbursement to be counted for that year because, like I said, a lot of employers only offer so much per year. So it may be $5,000, you want that $5,000 for 2020, but you also want that $5,000 for 2021. But yet, if you don't get the tuition reimbursement for your December classes or your fall semester, you don't get those grades until early January of 2021, then now they end up paying your 2020 tuition, but they end up paying in 2021 and it counts against you. So you can kind of explain this problem with them and basically explain that my grades won't come out till January. Is there any way I can get the tuition reimbursement in December? I can prove that I at least took these classes and what my general grade is. You can kind of show them some coursework that hopefully you got a good enough grade that seems like you did overall good in the class, but your final grade hasn't come out yet. So that's kind of an excuse you can give to a lot of HR people, is basically just say, my grades haven't come out yet. Is there any way I can get the tuition reimbursement fulfilled for this year? So that's it for this video. I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about tuition reimbursement because I don't really see it talked about in detail as far as the actual process. But if you have any further questions about it, feel free to comment down below. I have worked at a few different companies that have offered tuition reimbursement and seen how those programs have operated. So I do have a little bit more insight than that than maybe the typical average person may have. But, I'm not necessarily the end all be all as far as answering all these questions with tuition reimbursement. But if you like personal finance, economics, or anything like that, or behavioral finance, those are topics I really enjoy talking about. Consider subscribing to this channel, and I hope to see you in the next one.